So what do you do when you've ostensibly created the dictatorship of the proletariat, but you hardly have any proletarians? You build factories, lots of them, because where there are factories, there are workers. But if most of the peasants become workers, who will provide the workers with bread? And now that we've abolished commerce, what will the workers do with their wages? These are some of the questions facing Joseph Stalin in 1932 as his first 5-year plan for state-controlled industrialization goes into its chaotic last year. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years, covering all facets of life, the uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria, and ultimately humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Neidell. As the 20s progress, the USSR comes under increasing pressure from within to evolve. The country faces constant food shortages, despite that the former lands of the Russian Tsar are mainly agricultural. Industry is underdeveloped and infrastructure is far behind the Western world. Stalin and the rest of the Soviet Central Committee also perceive themselves to be under imminent threat from both within and abroad, so they want more military power. During the years of the Civil War and the ensuing wars, this had been solved with what became known as war communism, pretty much a euphemism for systematic plunder and robbery through war spoils, expropriation, and forced requisitioning of agricultural produce. Coupled with the abolition of free commerce and trade, already by 1921, this is having disastrous effects on the economy, with widespread starvation and unemployment crippling Bolshevik Russia and its dominions. Vladimir Lenin, then leader of the Soviet, sees no other way out than to implement his new economic policy, the NEP. It's an attempt to solve the immediate economic problems by reintroducing elements of free market economics, like profit-seeking and private trade. Yet several features, including banking and large industries, remain under state control. It solves the immediate pains somewhat. Most significantly, it leads to less starvation, but doesn't create much progress, especially not in manufacturing and infrastructure. See, the central problem for what has now become the USSR is that going back to the old ways won't solve that it's still, in large part, stuck in a pre-industrialized economic structure, which is perhaps paradoxical for a country that has now gone through a revolution meant to liberate the industrial working class masses. In reality, this means that it is everything but well-suited for Karl Marx's predicted workers' revolution that he foresaw in the industrialized countries of Western Europe, not the agrarian East. Marx posited that the establishment of socialism would come organically as a result of a majority working class in an industrialized society, creating social change from the grassroots. It's the belief that once freed of its shackles, and once class has been abolished by revolution, the proletariat will magically rule itself in a blissful dictatorship of the proletariat. But in the Soviet Union of the 1920s, if you feel that this Marxist vision is even possible and a must, such industrialization will have to be carried out to create this working class. And until then, the application of state power will need to be top-down. Obviously, it's quite a bit more complicated than that, but vastly simplified. Although the Bolsheviks claim a revolution in the name of the proletariat and the peasants, their relationship to the peasant class is at best ambivalent and at times downright murderous, as we shall see here and in a later episode. Anyway, when Lenin dies in 1924, the other communist leaders spend a few years infighting about who's going to be the new boss, instead of addressing this elephant in the room. It is mainly Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky who vie for power. Long story short, in 1928, Stalin emerges victorious as he expels Trotsky from the party and forces him into exile. Okay, Stalin now feels an urgent need to take the Russian-dominated Soviet Union forward at any price. He feels that the USSR is under imminent threat of either falling apart or being dissembled from external forces, or as he will ask rhetorically in 1931, do you want our socialist fatherland to be beaten and to lose its independence? If you do not want this, you must put an end to its backwardness in the shortest possible time. With fresh memories of the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the attempts at independence of the former western lands of the Russian Empire that resulted in millions of deaths, military needs are seen as fundamental. Beginning in 1926, the Soviet government undergoes a war scare that intensifies in 1927. While an imminent threat does not necessarily exist, the fear is not baseless. Just in January 1927, senior figures such as the editor-in-chief of Pravda, Nikolai Bukharin, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union, Alexei Rykov, and People's Commissar for Defense of the Soviet Union, Kliment Voroshilov, all warn of the imminence of war. In the East, they fear that Japan, or even the US, might renew activities on the Russian Western Pacific Rim that ended after the Civil War. They worry that Great Britain, who had also been involved in the Civil War, might encourage encroachment eastward by Poland. This worry is made particularly strong by Poland's policy of Prometheanism, a program by Josef Pilsudski, who is now dictator of Poland, to weaken the Soviet Union by supporting nationalist and separatist movements. To counter this, they need more arms, but they can no longer rely on war communism. There simply is not enough left to plunder. And despite a secret military exchange between the Red Army and the German Reichswehr starting already in 1921, they have few international allies that will support them. They can and do purchase arms from abroad, but lack the cash or credit worthiness needed to do so at scale, not to mention that it makes them dependent on foreign relations. Faced with all these urgencies, Stalin, with his deep-seated hatred of capitalism, sees only one way out: a strict military-style plan for rapid, state-controlled industrialization. And rapid is an understatement. In the same speech as earlier in 1931, he says, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we go under." So, as much as 10 times faster than the West developed. His instrument for that will be his 5-year plans, with goals set not on realism and opportunity, but on ideology and necessity. Rather than permitting the market to determine cost, production, and consumption, the 5-year plan is dictated by the government. Quotas are established for various products with the goal of increasing production significantly, all while the Soviet economy has barely recovered to its 1914 levels by 1928. It will be a brutal plan, built knowingly on the suffering, starvation, and death of millions of Soviet citizens. In fact, the targets are more than ambitious, they are simply unrealistic. The most dramatic effect on the people will come out of how they plan to feed the masses executing their plan. We'll cover that in a separate episode in detail, but for now, it's enough to say that the agrarian part of the plan has 2 parts: forced collectivization of all farms and the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, with the latter turning into downright mass murder. It is, in short, a catastrophic failure. Between 1928 and 1933, agricultural output diminishes by 18.5%, with livestock products falling by a stunning 56%. Not only does this create food shortages, even starvation, it has serious knock-on effects. For instance, the sudden drop in cattle, which were needed for draft power to plow the fields, results in a rise in the number of tractors needed. But instead of adjusting the plan, they simply raise the quota of new tractors. Decline in food production leads to the implementation of rationing in peacetime, decreasing productivity of the hungering workers. When they can't fulfill the quotas, they're just moved to the next deadline. Other materials, such as various metals, have to be imported. To finance that, they export food products like grain that are already not sufficient to feed the population. And even for an isolated economy like the USSR, starting in October 1929, the global depression further exacerbates import and export issues. But the plan still does not change. As Stalin tightens his dictatorial grip and his goals are not met, he uses radicalization to try to force the goals through. More cautious engineers are denounced as undermining the Soviet Union's advancement and labeled bourgeois saboteurs. The plan becomes more and more divorced from the reality on the ground. And yet, in 1931, Stalin confidently claims, "There are no fortresses Bolsheviks cannot capture." Economic planners with more limited visions are marginalized, while ideologues are promoted in their place in an increasingly out-of-control system. But, as the economic historian Eugene Zaleski notes, the goals may have been largely immaterial. Stalin was a man of action, and industrialization meant for him the intensified construction of factories, the development of new branches of industry and new regions, the improvement of labor skills, and the reduction of economic dependence on the outside world. His vision of industrial development was of a vast program of large works, but works carried out under the impetus of a drive imbued with ideological fanaticism. Under these conditions, what would it matter whether these immense works were completed in 3, 4, or 10 years? But the optimism that took hold of the planners had some justification. Following the end of the Russian Civil War, the Soviet economy, and the industrial sector in particular, saw a high growth rate. Experience in the First World War also contributed to the belief that resources were underutilized. For example, the Russian Empire had greater economic output in 1916 than in 1913, despite the effects of the war, including territorial losses. And as mentioned earlier, the ongoing war scare helped produce an existential fear in which rapid industrialization was less of a choice, but more of an urgent and unavoidable necessity. And believe it or not, in terms of industrial output, although it doesn't meet Stalin's insane goals, it is undoubtedly effective. Industrial output skyrockets, taking the Soviet Union from being the 5th nation in absolute terms of industrial capacity in 1928 to being number 2 by 1932, trailing only the United States. Not only that, many of the goals are achieved ahead of time. With the statistics on the first 2 years in hand, Stalin proclaims that the plan could be achieved in 4 years, partially due to what he calls the enthusiasm of the workers. This is embodied in posters that read 2 + 2 = 5. And it isn't a transformation that just focuses on putting out product. Prior to the 5-year plan, the Soviet Union lacks even the basic industries, which are needed for industrial development in the first place. So they depend on tools and machinery from abroad. Or, as the Soviet foreign trade theoretician D.D. Mishustin will note in 1938, the country's development depended on capitalist technology, and that equipment of the very latest design and construction was required in order to free the country from the need of importing this machinery and equipment once the goal had been reached. But now in 1932, the Soviets are still in desperate need of Western machinery, so they continue exporting their badly needed goods, like grain, while the population starves. And it isn't just food that is scarce. Living standards overall suffer considerably. While urban housing increases by 12%, that does not keep up with the massive urban population growth. And this is a slap in the face for the workers, who now go into newly built modern factories, only to return home to pre-war housing units without any kind of sanitation. Healthcare can't keep up with urbanization, and so on. But even if all that is solved, it's not enough to just keep people alive to keep them productive. The Bolsheviks now have to train largely uneducated peasants into skilled machine operators. It turns out to be a massive challenge, but they do manage to increase the skilled workforce to some degree with systematic training and new incentive structure. Skilled workers are given better housing and higher food rations. In October 1931, their wages increase on average by 30%. And for some, in say the coal and metal industries, wages increase by 100%. But what good are wage increases if one cannot spend money? Prior to the first 5-year plan, mass consumer goods were largely absent in the Soviet Union. The population instead relied on handcrafted products. But the kurstani, handcraft workers, are essentially wiped out as a category in 1928 with the forced elimination of private industry. In 1931 and 1932, when it becomes clear that paying people when there is nothing to buy doesn't make much sense, the kurstani are permitted to resume their old trades. In parallel, state-owned and run stores open that provide the slowly increasing output of consumer goods and the scarce food products. Well, in the countryside, food is not only scarce, it's hardly available at all, especially between the summer of 32 and the spring of 33. See, by then, to feed the growing proletariat, the Bolsheviks are simply going into the countryside and taking the already meager food away from the peasants, even literally stealing it off their kitchen tables. In this year, 1932, into mid-1933, farmers and their families will die in droves, especially in Ukraine. They will starve to the point that many will simply drop dead as they walk. Men, women, children, families, whole villages will succumb to what can only be described as a genocide by hunger. We will cover this in another episode. All in all, at least 4.5 million people, perhaps many more, will pay with their lives for Stalin's progress program. They die for a program of industrialization that will play an essential role in events causing even more deaths of Soviet citizens in only 8 years. But it will also have another essential effect on World War II. In fact, a decisive role. The Kremlin's effort at spreading out industry throughout the country, not just in the Western European portions of the country, results in massive industrialization past the Ural Mountains and into Central Asia. Great sprawling factories in the heartland of Russia where an invading army will have great difficulty to reach them. Factories that might now be producing tractors can easily be transformed into making guns, ammunition, planes, and tanks. Overall, it's a transformation on a scale that is hardly imaginable. One day, it will amaze Adolf Hitler, who, in the only surviving recording of a private conversation by the Führer, will express his utter shock to Finnish Field Marshal Mannerheim that in a single Soviet tank factory, there are 60,000 workers. And that is only one factory. Across the Soviet Union, there will be millions and millions of workers producing an endless output of the tools of death with tools carved from the dead. To understand how Stalin came to power in the first place, you can watch our Between Two Wars episode about that by clicking right here. Our patron of the week is Nicholas Arblaster. Thanks to Nicholas and his cool last name and the TimeGhost army, we can make more videos just like that. Do not forget to subscribe. And hey, we got 5 years. My brain hurts a lot. 5 years. That's all we've got.